Margaret Turner sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock marking the slow passage of time. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded yet another stack of bills, each one a silent reminder that the life she had imagined for herself decades ago had quietly slipped through her fingers. She ran her fingers over a faded photograph of her younger self standing proudly in front of an art exhibition that had been cancelled at the last minute, a bitter memory that still gnawed at her heart. "Is this what the rest of my life looks like?" she whispered to the empty room, the weight of 68 years pressing down on her chest. Her eyesight had grown weaker, her joints ached after walking even a few blocks, and she felt as though the world had begun to move on without her. She recalled the excitement she had once felt at the thought of starting her own art studio, the thrill of seeing her paintings hung on pristine walls, the joy of sharing her vision with an audience that mattered. Now, that dream felt like a cruel joke, a testament to missed opportunities and time lost. The phone rang, startling her, but it was only a telemarketer offering a vacation package she could never afford. She sighed, realizing the silence that followed was more deafening than the ringing. Her mind wandered to her son, Ethan, who had long stopped calling after their last argument 15 years ago. She remembered his disappointed eyes, the words that had cut deeper than any failure, "Mom, why do you always give up?" Those words had haunted her for years, echoing in her mind whenever she considered taking a risk. She felt invisible, irrelevant, a relic of a past that no longer mattered. On the small television perched on the counter, a late-night news segment played, showing footage of Elon Musk pacing through a SpaceX hangar, his face streaked with fatigue and determination. Margaret leaned forward, drawn in by the intensity of his story. The narrator explained how he had nearly lost everything, Tesla teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, SpaceX failing launch after launch, investors pulling out, critics ridiculing him at every turn. Yet despite the impossible odds, he had refused to quit. There was a spark in his eyes, a fire that refused to be extinguished. Margaret felt an unexpected shiver run down her spine, a flicker of curiosity stirring amidst the despair. She thought, if someone like him can face failure so publicly and still rise, maybe there's a chance for me too. She grabbed her tablet and began scrolling through articles and interviews, absorbing every story of Elon's setbacks, his sleepless nights, the relentless pursuit of his vision. She discovered that he had risked his own personal fortune multiple times, mortgaging his house and investing every penny he had into ventures others deemed foolish. Margaret realized she had spent years avoiding risk, shrinking into safety, letting fear dictate the course of her life. The juxtaposition of her cautious existence with Elon's audacity hit her with startling clarity. She felt a knot loosen in her chest, an unfamiliar sense of possibility, though doubt immediately crept in. "I'm not Elon Musk. I don't have his resources or energy. I'm too old to start over." Yet beneath the doubt, a whisper of courage began to grow. She recalled the first painting she had ever completed as a child, the way colors had seemed to dance under her brush, the exhilaration of creation. That memory mingled with the stories of Elon defying the odds, creating rockets that soared where none had before, cars that defied convention, ideas that seemed impossible yet became reality. Margaret's fingers hovered over a blank notebook, her heartbeat quickening. For the first time in years, she considered the idea that her story wasn't over, that the art she had abandoned decades ago could find life again. She paused, imagining herself walking into a small corner of her kitchen, setting up paints and brushes, and letting herself create without fear. She envisioned Ethan walking in years from now, seeing her work, and perhaps finally understanding the woman she had always been. Her mind raced with possibilities, yet she knew this spark would remain just that unless she acted. The quiet kitchen seemed to pulse with anticipation, the ticking clock no longer oppressive but rhythmic, like a heartbeat urging her forward. Margaret whispered to herself, "What if everything I believed about getting old was wrong?" She closed her eyes and pictured a future where she painted daily, connected again with her son, and shared her creations with the world. The fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of her courage, but the seed of hope had been planted. She opened her eyes and, with trembling hands, reached for the notebook. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? She murmured, imagining an audience beyond her kitchen walls. For the first time in decades, she felt a small thrill of possibility. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, whether she would succeed or fail, but she knew one thing: she had the power to take a single step, to act despite fear, and to reclaim a part of herself long thought lost. The television continued to show Elon Musk speaking to a group of young engineers, emphasizing that failure is an essential part of growth, that persistence is the bridge between dreams and reality. Margaret felt the words resonate in her bones, stirring an unfamiliar warmth of determination. She stood, her joints protesting slightly, but her resolve strengthening with every breath. She cleared the small table in the kitchen, placing the notebook, a set of old brushes, and a few tubes of paint she had found in a drawer long forgotten. The air smelled faintly of old paper and wax, but to Margaret, it carried the scent of possibility, of risk, of a life she could still shape. That night, under the dim glow of the overhead light, she began to draw tentative lines, hesitant at first, but then with increasing confidence. Each stroke of the brush felt like reclaiming a fragment of herself, each color a testament to courage rediscovered. The clock ticked on, but Margaret no longer felt the oppressive weight of time. Instead, she felt alive, ignited by the realization that age was not a cage, failure was not a sentence, and her story was far from finished. She looked once more at the television, at Elon Musk pacing through the hangar, the fire in his eyes mirroring the spark now in hers, and whispered, "Maybe it's not too late after all." And in that quiet, ordinary kitchen, Margaret Turner took her first deliberate step toward change, toward a life that still held meaning, passion, and the promise of rediscovery, unaware that this single moment would ripple outward, shaping a journey that would redefine everything she had once believed about age, failure, and her own worth. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Margaret Turner remembered the early mornings of her youth, the way sunlight had poured through the windows of her small apartment when she first moved to the city, the smell of fresh paint and canvas mingling with coffee, the sense that anything was possible. She had been a young art teacher, full of energy and hope, guiding children to discover their own creativity while secretly dreaming of opening her own studio, a space filled with colors and light where her work could live and breathe beyond the classroom. Those dreams had burned brightly for a time, and she had believed that with talent and perseverance, she could make them real. But life, as it often does, had other plans. There had been marriage, the steady rhythm of raising a child, the endless compromises of adulthood that quietly eroded ambition. Her husband, Richard, had been practical, kind in his own way, but always cautious, always reminding her to focus on security rather than risk. Margaret had complied, shelving her own ambitions, telling herself she could pursue them later, that there would always be time. But time had slipped away, unnoticed, silently carrying with it the fragments of her dreams. She remembered the last time she had attempted something bold, a local gallery agreeing to host her first solo exhibition. She had spent months preparing, pouring herself into every brushstroke, every composition, imagining the pride she would feel seeing her work hung with care and admiration. But on the day of the opening, the gallery owner had called to cancel, citing unforeseen circumstances, and Margaret had felt a crushing weight descend upon her chest. The disappointment had been more than professional, it had felt like a personal failure, a judgment on her very worth. She had cried alone in her apartment, the colors on her canvases blurring through tears, and for the first time, she had questioned whether her talent, her passion, and even her existence mattered. That memory had never truly left her, echoing in quiet moments, a reminder of what she had lost, of what life had denied her despite her efforts. As the years passed, her identity became defined by what she was not rather than what she could be. Retirement brought solitude rather than freedom. The apartment that had once been vibrant with possibility now felt like a cage, each quiet hour a mirror reflecting missed opportunities. She noticed the subtle changes in her body, the stiffness in her knees, the diminishing strength in her hands, the way her eyesight no longer captured the world in sharp detail but in a soft blur, like a fading photograph. Her social circle had narrowed, friends moved away, grew busy with their own lives, or passed on, leaving her with long stretches of silence that reminded her daily of her irrelevance. Margaret thought often of her son, Ethan, now 42, a successful software engineer living across the state. Their relationship had been strained since she had followed Richard's advice to prioritize stability over adventure, and the final break had come with a fight so bitter that neither spoke for years. Margaret replayed his words in her mind, harsh and piercing, "Mom, why do you always give up?" She could still hear the hurt in his voice, the disappointment that had fractured their bond. She had tried to reach out at times, leaving voicemails that went unanswered, emails that were ignored, small gestures that faded into silence. The regret of that lost connection gnawed at her constantly. Her life had narrowed into routines, grocery shopping, paying bills, taking the occasional walk around the block, and sitting in the living room watching television until exhaustion sent her to bed. She remembered the moments she had felt most alive, running her art classes, preparing lessons for children who laughed and learned under her guidance, the thrill of creation. But those moments had become memories, relics of a life that seemed distant and unreachable. Even simple joys were tempered by awareness of age and limitation. She walked slower, needed more rest, and felt the invisible barriers society imposed on older adults pressing down upon her. The world seemed to speak a language that no longer included her, messages of youth, energy, and innovation that marginalized her experience, dismissing it as outdated or irrelevant. Margaret's mornings often began with hesitation, the familiar ache in her back and joints making even small decisions feel monumental. She would stare out the window at neighbors bustling past, children riding bikes, couples jogging, the life of the world moving onward while she remained still, a witness rather than a participant. Loneliness had a way of settling into her bones, a quiet ache that she carried like a familiar companion. She sometimes imagined what her life could have been had she dared more, risked more, pursued her ambitions without fear. She pictured the studio she had always wanted, walls lined with her paintings, sunlight streaming in as visitors admired her work, the laughter and conversation filling the space, a place where she mattered. But these visions were quickly replaced with reality, empty walls, a quiet apartment, days that passed indistinguishably from one another. She remembered the night she finally let herself cry after the cancelled exhibition, the way tears had blurred her vision of the canvases, the brushstrokes smeared like her hopes and dreams, and how she had vowed never to allow herself that level of vulnerability again. That night had shaped her caution, her reluctance to try, and her fear of public failure. Over the decades, Margaret had developed a careful armor of pragmatism. She told herself that security was paramount, that avoiding risk would keep disappointment at bay. She reminded herself that at 68, her opportunities were limited, that youth belonged to others, and that the world would not pause to make space for her. Yet in quiet moments, when she allowed herself to remember, she felt a lingering ache for what had been denied, a spark of the passionate young woman who had once believed that the impossible was possible. She recalled evenings spent reading biographies of innovators and creators, people who had changed the world through audacity and persistence, though she had always considered them exceptions, not examples she could emulate. Elon Musk had been one of those figures, a man whose failures were public, whose ambitions were immense, whose refusal to give up inspired awe even in someone like Margaret, who had long since resigned herself to a life of quiet anonymity. Yet even as she admired him from a distance, she felt the sharp sting of contrast, his life filled with risk and action, hers marked by caution and inaction. The regret pressed in, heavier with each passing day. She remembered her art supplies tucked away in a closet, canvases stacked haphazardly, brushes stiff with dried paint, colors muted by time, yet she could still sense their potential, a reminder that her creativity had never truly vanished, only been dormant. Margaret thought of the small joys she had overlooked, the smile of a student, the quiet satisfaction of completing a painting, the thrill of discovery, the laughter shared with friends she had let slip away. Each memory was a bittersweet reminder of the life she had traded for safety and predictability. And yet, beneath the layers of regret and resignation, a fragile thread of longing persisted, a quiet hope that perhaps it was not too late. She could feel it stir in moments when she allowed herself to dream, when she imagined reclaiming a fragment of the life she had abandoned. Margaret understood, with a clarity that both terrified and exhilarated her, that her story had not yet ended, that the possibility for reinvention existed even now, at 68. She could choose to remain in the shadows of her past, or she could step forward, uncertain and vulnerable, into a future that held the faint glimmer of possibility. She thought of Ethan and the distance between them, realizing that time was a silent thief that would not wait for courage to catch up. She reflected on the quiet despair that had accompanied her days, recognizing it as a signal, a call to action if she was willing to answer. The juxtaposition of her past ambition and present caution created a tension within her, a quiet war between fear and longing, between resignation and desire. She considered the small steps she might take, reopening her paints, picking up her brushes, reclaiming her studio corner in the apartment, daring to create something for herself, without judgment, without expectation. She envisioned the day she might reach out to Ethan, risking rejection, but also the possibility of reconciliation, the restoration of connection long severed. Margaret realized that each choice, however small, carried the potential to shift the trajectory of her life, that momentum could begin with a single action, a single decision to reclaim agency. The memory of Elon Musk's failures and eventual triumphs lingered in her mind, a symbolic guide showing that perseverance, risk, and courage could overcome even the most formidable odds. She felt a stirring of determination, the first in many years, a sense that she could act despite fear, that she could reclaim her lost self in small, deliberate ways. Margaret began to imagine herself creating, reconnecting, living, in a series of vivid, cinematic images, her hands streaked with paint, canvases lined up along the walls, sunlight catching colors in motion, Ethan standing nearby, admiration and understanding in his eyes, a life transformed not by luck but by courage and persistence. The possibilities were overwhelming yet intoxicating, and for the first time in decades, Margaret felt a pulse of excitement, a thrill of potential. She understood that the journey ahead would not be easy, that doubt, physical limitations, and societal expectations would challenge her at every step, but she also knew that the spark within her could ignite action, that she could reclaim fragments of her lost ambition and reconstruct a life imbued with meaning, creativity, and connection. The memory of her cancelled exhibition and the years of quiet resignation no longer felt like chains but like stepping stones, reminders of resilience and the capacity to begin again. Margaret's heart quickened as she contemplated taking her first step, small and deliberate, opening the closet, retrieving her brushes, setting up a workspace, and committing to action despite fear. She realized that age was not a prison, that failure was not final, and that even now, she could begin the work of reclaiming herself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over her quiet apartment, Margaret Turner felt a shift within her, a subtle but undeniable movement from despair to possibility, from resignation to determination, from invisibility to the faint stirrings of purpose, and in that moment, she resolved to begin, to act, to reclaim the life she had long thought lost, knowing that this was the first step in a journey that could transform not only her own world but the world of those she loved, beginning with herself. Margaret Turner stared at the small corner of her kitchen she had cleared for painting, brushes and canvases stacked neatly, the blank notebook open as if daring her to begin. The air felt heavy with expectation, her heartbeat echoing in her ears, each tick of the clock a reminder that time was passing and she was still 68, still vulnerable, still untested. Doubt rose like a tide in her chest. Am I too old for this? Will anyone care? What if I fail again? Her mind replayed years of cautious choices, abandoned dreams, and the cruel whisper of her son's disappointed words, "Mom, why do you always give up?" She had lived long enough to know the ache of failure, yet the ache of inaction was proving equally unbearable. She picked up a brush, then set it down again, unable to commit, her hands trembling not from age alone but from the weight of expectation she placed on herself. Outside, neighbors moved briskly, energetic and purposeful, their lives seemingly full of meaning, while she remained stationary, a shadow in the periphery, wondering if she had exhausted her chance to matter. She recalled the news segment she had watched the night before, Elon Musk pacing through the SpaceX hangar, his face streaked with fatigue, yet lit with determination. The story of his near bankruptcy, of rockets exploding on launch pads, of Tesla teetering on the edge, played in her mind like a mantra: persistence is the bridge between dreams and reality. She wanted to believe that those words applied to her, that failure at her age was not a permanent sentence, but the voice of fear screamed louder. She imagined opening the notebook and pouring her soul into creation, but her mind hesitated, conjuring images of ridicule, judgment, and humiliation. Friends and acquaintances had long since stopped offering encouragement, some dismissing her quietly, others openly questioning why she would waste her time with hobbies at your age. The thought of her son discovering her efforts and seeing them as frivolous made her chest tighten, yet she also longed for connection, to show him that she still had life and passion within her. The inner war raged, a relentless battle between fear and longing, resignation and desire, caution and courage. She remembered the failed exhibition decades ago, the humiliation and heartbreak, the tears alone in her apartment as she vowed never to expose herself to such vulnerability again. That memory, once a chain, now felt like both a warning and a challenge. The past could instruct her, but it need not dictate her future. Margaret's gaze drifted to the blank canvas leaning against the wall, its emptiness a reflection of both potential and terror. She could see herself creating, colors flowing, forms emerging, yet the act of beginning seemed monumental, as though her age and life experiences had rendered her incapable of simple action. She sat in silence, her hands folded over each other, breathing in and out, attempting to quiet the storm of doubt within. Her thoughts shifted to Elon Musk once more, the way he had risked everything, mortgaged his house, invested his own fortune, and faced public scorn, yet persisted with unrelenting focus. She marveled at his fearlessness, the way he embraced risk not for the sake of thrill but for the sake of purpose. She thought, if someone like him can face failure so publicly and still rise, maybe I can, too. Yet immediately, the skeptic within reminded her that she was not Elon Musk, that she lacked his resources, energy, and audacity. She felt the crushing pressure of comparison, the temptation to retreat, to leave the canvas blank, and hide behind years of safe choices. Margaret's phone buzzed, breaking her reverie, a notification from a community art forum. Hesitant, she opened it and saw a post about a local art showcase, a chance for beginners and seasoned artists alike to display work. The opportunity stirred something within her, excitement mingling with fear. She imagined standing among strangers, her work judged and scrutinized, her failures laid bare, yet also the possibility of recognition, connection, and pride. The thought terrified her and thrilled her in equal measure. Her mind flashed to Ethan, imagining him walking into a gallery years from now, seeing her work, perhaps finally understanding the woman she had always been beneath the layers of caution and compromise. The image was at once tender and terrifying, a test of courage she had avoided for decades. She returned to the canvas, fingers hovering over the brush. Each second stretched into eternity, the battle between fear and desire intensifying. She remembered advice from a podcast she had heard while cleaning the apartment, Elon Musk speaking about the importance of action despite uncertainty. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Margaret realized that her desire to paint, to reconnect with herself and her son, was important enough. The thought anchored her, though the fear did not dissipate. It only became a challenge to overcome. She inhaled deeply, steadying her trembling hands, and made a decision: she would create, no matter the outcome, even if only for herself, even if no one ever saw it. She picked up the brush and touched it to the page, feeling the texture of the paper beneath the bristles, the resistance and promise of a line waiting to emerge. The first stroke was tentative, a thin, uncertain mark, but it carried a weight of defiance, a whisper of courage. She paused, studying it, then added another line, bolder this time, then another. The canvas slowly filled, not with a masterpiece yet, but with evidence of action, proof that she had begun. Margaret felt a small but profound shift. The inner war had not ended, but she had won the first battle by choosing to act. The fear remained, a persistent presence, but it no longer dictated her motion. She thought of Elon's repeated failures, the rockets that did not launch, the cars that nearly bankrupted him, and saw a reflection of her own stalled ambitions. He had failed publicly, yet continued with purpose. Perhaps she could, too, at her own pace, in her own way. She worked through the afternoon, the tension in her chest easing slightly with each brushstroke. The world outside continued, indifferent to her actions, but within the small corner of her kitchen, a universe was forming, shaped by her hands and imagination. Margaret began to imagine the journey ahead, opening more canvases, experimenting with colors and forms, posting her work online, tentatively reconnecting with Ethan, taking steps that might seem small but could ripple outward in ways she could not yet predict. She recognized that the inner war would recur, that doubt would return, that society's dismissive gaze and her own fear would challenge every step. Yet she had discovered a critical truth: action, no matter how small, broke the paralysis of fear. Each stroke of paint, each choice to try, was a declaration that she still mattered, that her voice and vision retained value, and that age did not dictate the boundaries of her potential. Evening fell, the apartment darkening, yet Margaret remained at her corner, immersed in creation. Her muscles ached, her joints protested, but a deeper sense of vitality coursed through her, fueled by engagement and purpose. She realized that the battle within was not merely against fear but against the quiet erosion of self imposed by years of caution, regret, and societal expectation. By acting, she reclaimed fragments of herself, asserting her presence and agency in a world that often overlooked those of her age. The thought of facing others, of sharing her work, still loomed ahead, a challenge she would need to confront with courage. Yet the inner war had shifted, fear remained, but it was no longer dominant. Margaret reflected on the decade-long silence with her son, the years lost to misunderstanding, and recognized that courage in this moment could plant seeds for reconciliation, that vulnerability could open doors long closed. The notion terrified and exhilarated her simultaneously. She imagined walking into the community center with a painting in hand, presenting it to strangers and family alike, and felt the tension of anticipation, the possibility of connection, and the risk of exposure. It was terrifying, but thrilling. She picked up another brush, adding strokes with more confidence, colors merging and contrasting in ways that felt alive. She realized that the act of creating was not simply about the final product but about the process itself, about proving to herself that she could still act, still risk, still matter. Margaret glanced at the clock, its ticking now a rhythmic companion rather than a reminder of lost time. She understood that the inner war would never fully disappear, that doubt, fear, and uncertainty would accompany her for the remainder of her life. Yet she had discovered a strategy, a path forward: persistence, small actions, and the willingness to face discomfort head-on. She envisioned the next day, retrieving more canvases, experimenting with new techniques, perhaps posting an image online, perhaps calling Ethan, taking incremental steps that cumulatively could redefine her sense of self. The shift within her was subtle yet undeniable, from paralysis to motion, from hopelessness to tentative hope, from invisibility to the spark of agency. Elon Musk's presence, though symbolic, continued to guide her imagination and resolve, a reminder that greatness often emerged through repeated failures and relentless action. Margaret set down the brush for a moment, breathing deeply, acknowledging both her fear and her courage. She felt the tension in her chest ease slightly, replaced with determination. She realized that the inner war was not a battle to be won once but a companion she could learn to navigate, each choice a declaration that she would not be defined by fear, failure, or age. She imagined a timeline of possibilities, completing a small series of paintings, sharing them with a local community, reconnecting with her son, and perhaps inspiring others who had long believed it was too late for them. Each vision carried both risk and hope, a reminder that action in the presence of fear was the truest measure of courage. Night settled into the apartment, yet Margaret remained at her corner, the canvas now vibrant with the first fruits of her efforts. The inner war continued, yet it was tempered by the knowledge that she had begun, that she had taken the first steps toward reclaiming her life, creativity, and sense of purpose. She reflected on the journey that lay ahead, recognizing that the path would be neither easy nor predictable, but entirely worth navigating. Margaret Turner, once paralyzed by doubt and regret, had taken the first steps in an internal revolution, fueled by courage, guided by inspiration, and illuminated by the knowledge that even at 68, she could act, she could create, she could still matter, and the story of her life was far from finished. Margaret Turner awoke the next morning with a restless energy she hadn't felt in years, the memory of the previous evening's tentative strokes on the canvas still vivid in her mind. The sunlight streamed through the apartment window, casting long shadows across the small kitchen that had become her sanctuary of possibility. She moved quickly, clearing the table once more, arranging brushes, paints, and her notebook in precise order, a ritual of readiness that filled her with anticipation. The doubt that had so often shackled her felt present but less formidable, as though it had been tempered by the small victory of action the night before. She thought about Elon Musk again, about the countless setbacks he had faced, the rockets that failed, the investors who walked away, the media that mocked his audacious dreams, and how he had persisted anyway. His words replayed in her mind, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Margaret repeated them silently, feeling them embed themselves into her consciousness, infusing her with a courage she had long thought lost. She picked up her brush, the familiar weight comforting against her fingers, and began to paint. At first, the strokes were cautious, the colors timid, the forms hesitant, but as minutes passed, she felt the rhythm return, the brush flowing like an extension of her own will. Each line, each hue, became a declaration: she existed, she created, she mattered. The act of painting, so simple yet profound, ignited a spark within her, a sense of life and purpose that had been dormant for decades. Margaret paused, stepping back to observe her work, and allowed herself a small, almost shy smile. For the first time in years, she felt seen, if not by others, then by herself, and that acknowledgement carried a weight far greater than any external validation. The kitchen felt alive, bathed in sunlight and possibility, each canvas a testament to courage reclaimed, each brushstroke a bridge across the years of hesitation and regret. She imagined herself posting a photograph of her work online, tentatively sharing it with strangers who might appreciate her effort, and the thought both exhilarated and terrified her. The idea of exposure, of judgment, made her stomach tighten, yet the desire to connect, to extend the reach of her regained purpose, outweighed the fear. She recalled the news segment featuring Elon Musk, the image of him pacing through the SpaceX hangar, tireless and unrelenting, and felt a kinship, a symbolic guidance that whispered, "Start small, persist, and allow action to lead you forward." That day, Margaret made a choice that felt monumental despite its apparent simplicity. She would not only paint but document her progress, share her journey, and engage with the world, even if just a little. She retrieved her tablet, setting up a simple photography station with the corner of her kitchen, capturing her first tentative piece, the brushstroke still raw and exploratory, yet alive with intention. As she uploaded the image to a small online art forum, she hesitated before pressing post, the familiar fear of rejection clawing at her resolve. Then she remembered Elon's mantra: persistence in the face of fear is what separates action from stagnation. She clicked the button. Immediately, a sense of release washed over her, a lightness she hadn't known in years. Margaret moved on to her next painting, her strokes growing bolder, her colors more vibrant, and her confidence increasing with each mark. The spark had ignited into a small flame, feeding on action, courage, and the quiet thrill of possibility. Hours passed unnoticed. Margaret barely registered the aches in her joints or the fatigue that her age had accustomed her to, her mind and spirit fully immersed in the creative flow. The world outside continued as it always had, indifferent to her actions, yet within her small kitchen, a revolution was underway. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in decades, a quiet but undeniable proof that purpose and joy could be reclaimed, even at 68. The thought of her son, Ethan, occasionally flitted across her mind, but she pushed it gently aside, focusing instead on herself, on this small but meaningful act of creation. She understood that action must come first, connection would follow once she had proven to herself that she was capable of risking, of trying, of existing beyond the shadows of fear. As evening approached, Margaret stepped back from her latest work, a small canvas filled with daring colors and sweeping lines, the composition tentative yet undeniably alive. The satisfaction that bloomed in her chest was mingled with awe. She had done this, had created something from the depth of her own rediscovered courage. The spark had transformed into a flame, not wild and consuming but steady and persistent, capable of lighting the way forward. Her phone buzzed, and she saw notifications on the art forum, a single comment from a stranger, simple words but profound in their effect, "Beautiful. Keep going." Margaret's eyes widened, her chest tightened, and a smile broke across her face. Recognition, even from someone she did not know, validated what she had felt. Her effort mattered. She felt the flicker of connection, a reminder that her work could reach beyond the walls of her apartment, that her creativity was not limited to her own gaze. The spark of possibility had been amplified. Margaret realized that the fear she had carried for decades, the doubts that had silenced her voice and her brush, could be tempered by action and small victories. Each brushstroke, each shared image, each acknowledgement from a stranger became a step forward in a journey that had seemed impossible just days ago. She reflected on the transformative power of small acts, opening a corner of her kitchen for creation, daring to paint despite fear, documenting and sharing the result, receiving the first glimmer of external validation. Each action was simple, yet cumulatively, they represented a profound shift, a movement from paralysis to agency. Margaret considered her life before this moment, the years of caution, the quiet resignation, the endless routines that had dulled her spirit. She realized that the spark she now felt had been dormant all along, waiting only for her to take the first step, for her to risk, for her to act. Elon Musk, though not physically present, had become a symbolic guide, a reminder that persistence in the face of risk, action in the presence of fear, and commitment to one's purpose could overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The thought filled her with determination. She could continue, she would continue, she must continue. She envisioned the next day, retrieving more canvases, experimenting with new techniques, daring to post her work more widely, perhaps even reaching out to her son in a tentative step toward reconciliation. The spark of creativity had become a roadmap for action, illuminating possibilities previously hidden by fear and regret. Margaret's mind swirled with ideas, a series of paintings capturing the emotions and memories of her life, each piece a testament to resilience, creativity, and the willingness to act. She imagined documenting the process, sharing insights, and perhaps inspiring others who had long believed it was too late for them to begin again. The act of creation had become a catalyst, igniting courage that extended beyond the canvas into every corner of her life. As night descended, she cleaned her brushes, careful to preserve the paint for the next session, and stepped back to observe her work. The kitchen, once a mundane and silent space, now seemed charged with energy, a sanctuary of possibility, a place where action and courage coalesced into tangible outcomes. Margaret felt a profound sense of accomplishment, tempered with humility. She had acted despite fear, embraced vulnerability, and begun to reclaim herself. The spark was no longer a mere flicker, it was a steady flame capable of lighting the path forward. She allowed herself to imagine the broader implications, a renewed sense of purpose, a reconnection with her son, the potential to influence and inspire others who had resigned themselves to quiet desperation. The possibilities seemed endless, yet grounded in the simple, deliberate steps she had taken today. The tension between fear and courage remained, but the balance had shifted decisively. Margaret felt empowered, capable of confronting uncertainty, of acting despite doubt, of embracing life in its full complexity. She understood that the journey would be ongoing, that challenges would arise, yet she now possessed a strategy: act, persist, create, share, and allow progress to compound. She reflected on the lesson inherent in Elon Musk's story, that failure is not final, that persistence transforms possibility into reality, that courage manifests not in the absence of fear but in action despite it. Margaret Turner, once paralyzed by doubt and hesitation, now recognized that she could chart her own course, reclaiming the life she had long believed was behind her. As she extinguished the kitchen light, leaving the canvases illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. She felt a profound shift within her. The spark of possibility had ignited a flame of action, determination, and courage, and the journey ahead, though uncertain and challenging, was hers to navigate, filled with the promise of creativity, connection, and the reclamation of her own worth. That night, Margaret lay in bed with a quiet exhilaration, the echo of brushstrokes in her mind, a rhythm that mirrored her heartbeat and reminded her that life, even at 68, could be reshaped, reimagined, and lived fully. The spark had become a guiding force, and she resolved that she would not squander it, that each day would be an opportunity to act, create, and move closer to the life she had once only dreamed of, and now, with courage, could begin to build. Margaret Turner sat in her kitchen, staring at the latest painting she had finished, a bold composition of colors that swirled and clashed yet somehow balanced, a reflection of her own tumultuous emotions. She held her phone in her hand, debating whether to call her son, Ethan, who had not spoken to her in over 15 years. The thought of his potential rejection made her stomach knot, but the spark that had ignited in her over the past few days pushed her forward. Margaret reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear but action despite it. She dialed his number and heard the ringing echo in her chest. On the third ring, a voice she recognized immediately answered, a mixture of surprise and guardedness, "Mom?" She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ethan, it's me. I wanted to share something with you." Silence followed, filled with tension, memories, and the unspoken weight of years. Finally, Ethan said, "Okay. I'm listening." Margaret described the painting she had been working on, her tentative steps into creative expression, her desire to reconnect not only with her art but with him. Ethan listened, and though the tone remained cautious, she sensed a flicker of interest, a crack in the wall of years of estrangement. "That's actually really cool, Mom," he said finally. Margaret felt a rush of relief and warmth, reminder that even small acts of courage could yield connection. The conversation ended with a promise from Ethan to visit soon, and Margaret hung up, tears welling in her eyes. The victory was small but meaningful, proof that risk could produce reward, and that hope was never entirely lost. Yet the world outside her apartment remained skeptical. Friends and acquaintances learned of her renewed artistic pursuits and questioned the practicality of her efforts. "At your age? Why not just enjoy your retirement quietly?" they asked, their words laced with concern but also doubt. Margaret felt the familiar sting of judgment but refused to allow it to define her path. She realized that societal skepticism, like fear, was an external challenge that could either paralyze or fortify her resolve. She chose the latter. The next day, she decided to attend a local art workshop, a small community gathering for artists of all ages. The building smelled of paint and wood, a comforting combination that reminded her of her early days as a teacher and a creator. She set up her supplies at a table, noticing other participants glancing at her with curiosity, some with skepticism, others with polite interest. Margaret felt the familiar tension rise in her chest, the inner war of fear and desire intensifying. She recalled Elon Musk's perseverance, the way he had faced critics, investors, and media ridicule, yet continued to act on his vision. She reminded herself that courage required persistence and that external skepticism could not dictate her worth or capability. As the workshop began, Margaret observed the other artists, some young, some older, all working with varying levels of skill and confidence. She felt both self-conscious and inspired, recognizing that vulnerability was part of the creative process. When the instructor called for everyone to share their work in progress, Margaret hesitated, her hands shaking slightly as she held her canvas. The group's eyes turned toward her, and she felt the weight of scrutiny pressing down. The instructor smiled encouragingly and said, "Don't worry about judgment, focus on expression." Margaret took a deep breath and placed her painting on the easel, revealing the bold swirls of color that represented her journey, her fears, her rediscovered purpose. A hush fell over the group, followed by murmurs of admiration. "Wow, the energy here is amazing," one participant said. Another added, "I love the emotion in your work, it really speaks. Margaret felt a rush of pride and relief, a validation she had long thought impossible at her age. The skepticism she had anticipated dissolved, replaced by genuine acknowledgement and encouragement. She realized that the act of showing her work, despite fear and doubt, had shifted perceptions and opened doors that had seemed permanently closed. Encouraged, she continued to paint, experimenting with colors and textures she had long avoided, embracing the unpredictability of creative expression. Each brushstroke became an act of defiance against both internal doubt and external skepticism, a statement that she could still create, still matter, and still inspire. Margaret returned home that evening with a renewed sense of purpose, her mind buzzing with ideas for new pieces, potential exhibitions, and ways to reconnect with her son. She documented the day in her notebook, reflecting on the courage it had taken to face the workshop and the unexpected validation she had received. She recognized that external skepticism was inevitable, but it could not overshadow the internal transformation she was undergoing. In the following weeks, Margaret faced more instances of doubt and skepticism. Friends questioned her commitment, neighbors expressed surprise at her continued activity, and even some family members suggested that she focus on age-appropriate hobbies. Each comment tested her resolve, yet she found strength in the small victories she had accumulated, a conversation with her son, positive feedback from peers, the tangible evidence of her creative output. Margaret began to understand that skepticism was not a barrier but a filter, separating those who could support her journey from those whose doubt reflected their own limitations. She learned to listen selectively, to internalize encouragement, and to dismiss criticism that was rooted in fear rather than constructive guidance. One morning, she received an email from a local gallery interested in featuring her work in a small exhibit for emerging and mature artists. Margaret's heart leapt, but fear immediately followed. What if they reject me? What if no one shows up? She reminded herself that action, not hesitation, was the antidote to fear. She accepted the opportunity, understanding that even a small step could lead to transformative outcomes. In preparation, she painted daily, refining her techniques, exploring new themes, and documenting her progress. The skepticism of the world remained a background hum, a reminder of the challenges inherent in pursuing something meaningful, yet Margaret felt increasingly empowered. She realized that courage compounded with each action, each small victory reinforcing the belief that she could face both internal doubt and external criticism. The day of the exhibit arrived, and Margaret carefully transported her canvases to the gallery. She noticed the glances of other artists, some curious, some indifferent, but she focused on her purpose, to share her work and reclaim a sense of agency. Visitors began to arrive, their expressions a mix of interest and surprise. As they moved from painting to painting, Margaret observed their reactions, smiles, nods, questions, and genuine admiration. A young couple lingered at her piece, discussing the emotion conveyed and the bold use of color. Margaret felt a swell of pride, realizing that her courage had created a space for connection and appreciation. During the exhibit, Ethan arrived, a mixture of hesitation and curiosity on his face. Margaret felt a knot of nervousness but reminded herself to remain present, to act with authenticity rather than fear. Ethan moved from painting to painting, finally standing in front of her canvas, his eyes widening as he absorbed the composition. "Mom," he said softly, this is incredible." Margaret's chest tightened with emotion, tears welling in her eyes. The acknowledgement, the recognition from her son, was a culmination of the small acts of courage and persistence she had undertaken. She realized that facing skepticism, both internal and external, had been necessary to arrive at this moment of validation and connection. The exhibit continued, and Margaret engaged with visitors, sharing her process, her inspirations, and her journey of rediscovery. She noticed that people responded not only to her work but to her story, the courage it took to pursue creativity at her age despite doubt and societal expectations. Margaret reflected on the transformation that had occurred within her, from paralysis to action, from fear to courage, from invisibility to recognition. She understood that external skepticism could challenge but not define her, that persistence in the face of doubt was a source of empowerment, and that small, deliberate actions had the power to reshape her life. By the end of the evening, Margaret felt a profound sense of accomplishment and hope. She had faced skepticism, risked vulnerability, and emerged with validation, connection, and renewed purpose. The spark that had ignited in her kitchen weeks earlier had grown into a steady flame, illuminating a path forward filled with creativity, courage, and the potential for meaningful relationships. As she returned home, carrying the remnants of her work and the memories of the evening, Margaret knew that this was only the beginning. Skepticism would continue to arise, doubt would linger, and challenges would persist, but she had discovered the power of persistence, action, and courage. She resolved to continue painting, sharing her journey, and nurturing the connections she had begun to rebuild. The world's doubt no longer dictated her actions, instead, it served as a backdrop against which her courage and determination shone even more brightly. Margaret Turner, once paralyzed by fear and skepticism, had reclaimed her agency, embraced vulnerability, and proven that age, doubt, and societal expectations could not confine her creativity, purpose, or capacity for connection. The spark that had ignited within her had become a guiding force, a reminder that courage, persistence, and action could overcome skepticism, and that the journey of rediscovery was both possible and profoundly rewarding. That night, Margaret reflected on her path, recognizing that the battles she had fought, internal doubt, fear of rejection, societal skepticism, had prepared her for a life of renewed purpose. She understood that the act of facing skepticism was itself transformative, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a prelude to the continued evolution of her creativity, connections, and personal fulfillment. Margaret Turner woke the next morning with a sense of purpose that had been absent for decades. The exhilaration of the exhibit, the validation from strangers and from her son, Ethan, still pulsed in her chest, mingling with a nervous anticipation of what she could accomplish next. She realized that the moment she had feared, the judgment, the skepticism, the potential failure, had transformed into something liberating, proof that action outweighed hesitation, courage outweighed fear, and that one decisive choice could ripple through her life in ways she had long forgotten were possible. Margaret knew, with the clarity that sometimes only emerges after a breakthrough, that she could not remain passive any longer. She needed to commit to a singular, focused action that would anchor her efforts and create momentum, a choice that would alter the trajectory of her days and her life. She had experimented, she had faced skepticism, and she had felt the spark of creation. Now it was time to commit fully, to take a bold step that would consolidate all the small victories she had achieved into tangible, lasting transformation. She walked into the small corner of her apartment that she had designated as her studio, the walls lined with canvases of varying sizes, each one capturing fragments of her emotional journey, experiments with color and form, and the courage she had begun to cultivate. Margaret surveyed the collection and felt a mixture of pride, apprehension, and exhilaration. The thought that had surfaced over and over in her mind, the idea of teaching, of sharing, of connecting her creative rebirth to others, loomed large. She realized that the one thing she could change, the pivotal act that would catalyze the next stage of her transformation, was to begin teaching again, to open her own small workshop for local adults, particularly those who had long felt their potential had passed, who had been told it was too late, who had been silenced by fear, doubt, or societal expectation. Margaret understood that teaching would not only extend her influence beyond the walls of her apartment but would also reinforce her own courage, purpose, and commitment. She envisioned a small space, modest but welcoming, where others could experiment, create, and reclaim the parts of themselves they had long neglected. She thought about Elon Musk, the way he had tackled audacious goals one step at a time, how he had focused relentlessly on solving one problem at a time, yet allowed each solution to compound into massive, transformative outcomes. She realized that this workshop could be her one thing, the pivotal choice that would integrate all her previous efforts into a coherent, meaningful action. Margaret spent the morning planning. She drafted a simple outline for the workshop, focusing on encouragement, experimentation, and personal expression rather than technical mastery. She reached out to a local community center, proposing a small pilot class, and felt her nerves spike at the thought of rejection. She reminded herself of the weeks leading up to the exhibit, of the small steps that had led to success, and pressed forward with determination. The community center responded positively, intrigued by the idea of a workshop tailored to adults who had been told it was too late to explore creativity. Margaret felt a thrill of possibility. Her tentative plan had already begun to take root in reality. She spent the following days preparing materials, arranging canvases, organizing brushes, and sketching exercises that would gently challenge participants while honoring their individual journeys. Each action felt monumental, yet achievable, and each decision reinforced her sense of agency. Margaret also reflected on her own creative journey, recognizing that the act of teaching would deepen her skills, expand her confidence, and extend the reach of her story, both to her students and to herself. She felt a surge of anticipation as she imagined the faces of the participants, adults who might feel, as she had, that opportunity and passion had passed them by. The thought of helping them rediscover their voice filled her with purpose and excitement. On the morning of the first class, Margaret arrived early, her heart pounding with both excitement and nerves. She arranged the tables, placed supplies in neat containers, and added a few touches, a vase of fresh flowers, a gentle playlist of instrumental music, to create a welcoming, inspiring environment. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that courage was cumulative, built one choice, one action, and one moment at a time. As participants arrived, Margaret greeted them warmly, noting the mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and quiet hope on their faces. She introduced herself, sharing briefly her story of rediscovery, her years of hesitation, and the courage it had taken to return to art. The room seemed to respond, a shared understanding that they had all arrived carrying their own fears, regrets, and doubts. Margaret guided the first exercise gently, encouraging participants to experiment with color, texture, and form, to embrace mistakes as part of the creative process, and to allow themselves freedom in expression. The atmosphere shifted as participants began to relax, to engage, to explore their own creativity without judgment. Margaret circulated the room, offering encouragement, gentle guidance, and acknowledgement of each person's efforts. She observed transformations in real time. Hesitant strokes became confident lines, tentative choices became bold expressions, fear yielding to curiosity and joy. Margaret felt an almost indescribable fulfillment, a sense that the act of teaching not only enriched the lives of her students but also reinforced her own sense of purpose and agency. Each interaction became a reminder that age, skepticism, and past failures did not define the potential for growth, creativity, and connection. As the class progressed, one participant, a man in his 70s named Robert, shared that he had always wanted to paint but had been told by his family that it was a waste of time. Margaret listened, her own heart swelling with empathy and recognition. She encouraged him gently, helped him select colors, and guided his hand with suggestions while allowing his own vision to emerge. Robert's eyes lit up as he added a bold stroke, and a sense of joy and accomplishment washed over him. Margaret realized that these moments were more than artistic instruction, they were acts of empowerment, small but profound affirmations of self-worth, courage, and possibility. The first class concluded with participants sharing their work and discussing their experiences. Laughter, encouragement, and admiration filled the room, creating a sense of community and shared triumph. Margaret felt a profound satisfaction, recognizing that the one thing she had changed, choosing to teach, to create impact beyond herself, had already begun to ripple outward, affecting others in meaningful ways. In the days following the initial workshop, Margaret continued to refine her teaching, integrating feedback, observing participant growth, and embracing her evolving role as mentor and guide. She noted the cumulative effect on herself. Increased confidence, renewed purpose, strengthened creative skills, and a growing sense of connection to the community. Margaret also began documenting the workshops online, sharing photos and stories, expanding her reach, and inspiring others who had long believed it was too late to pursue their passions. The response was encouraging, with messages of support, appreciation, and curiosity arriving from strangers, friends, and even distant relatives. Margaret reflected on the journey that had led her here, the initial hesitation in her apartment, the tentative brushstrokes, the exhibit, the re-established connection with her son, the courage to face skepticism, and now the bold choice to teach. Each step had built upon the previous, a chain of action transforming fear into purpose, isolation into connection, and inaction into meaningful contribution. She understood that the one thing she had changed was not merely the act of teaching but the deliberate choice to commit fully to a purpose that extended beyond herself, a choice that had multiplied in impact, reinforcing her own sense of value and the potential for meaningful influence. Margaret also recognized the symbolic significance of her journey, a 68-year-old woman reclaiming agency, creativity, and influence, defying societal expectations, challenging ageist assumptions, and inspiring both her students and herself. She thought of Elon Musk again, seeing his audacious goals, relentless persistence, and willingness to fail publicly as a mirror for her own approach: act decisively, embrace risk, and persist despite fear. The choice to teach became a focal point, a tangible manifestation of courage and purpose that anchored all her subsequent actions. Margaret found joy in the ongoing process, preparing for workshops, observing participants grow, experimenting with new creative techniques, and reflecting on the impact of her choices. Each day reinforced the understanding that transformation is cumulative, built upon small, deliberate, courageous steps, and that the willingness to act despite fear and doubt is the essence of meaningful change. She also began to notice changes in herself beyond creativity and purpose: increased energy, a renewed sense of agency, deeper emotional resilience, and a growing capacity for connection with others, including the slow but steady rebuilding of trust and intimacy with her son. Margaret recognized that the one thing she had changed, the commitment to teaching and sharing her journey, had catalyzed a series of positive transformations, creating momentum that extended across all aspects of her life. She reflected on the power of a single decisive choice. It had shifted her trajectory from passive observation to active participation, from fear to courage, from invisibility to meaningful impact. The ripple effects of her action were visible not only in her own growth but in the lives of those she touched, reinforcing the transformative potential inherent in deliberate, courageous choices. Margaret also observed the subtle but profound effect on her community. Participants in her workshops began sharing their own work publicly, forming connections, and embracing their creative potential in ways they had long believed impossible. Margaret felt a quiet pride, recognizing that her courage had inspired others to act, to risk, and to reclaim aspects of themselves that had long been dormant. This realization reinforced her understanding that meaningful change is not solitary but relational, that impact multiplies when courage is modeled and shared, and that one decisive act can generate a cascade of transformation. Margaret Turner had, through a series of small but deliberate choices, transformed fear into action, doubt into persistence, and isolation into connection. By identifying the one thing she could change, teaching and sharing her journey, she created a focal point for courage, purpose, and impact, demonstrating that even late in life, deliberate action can yield profound transformation. As Margaret prepared for her next workshop, she felt the steady flame of purpose burning within her, a source of energy, motivation, and clarity. She understood that challenges would continue, skepticism would arise, and fear would persist, yet she had discovered the power of decisive action, the compounding effects of courage, and the transformative potential of one committed choice. Margaret Turner had reclaimed her agency, creativity, and purpose, proving that age, doubt, and societal expectations could not constrain meaningful action. The one thing she had changed, the decision to teach, to share, and to create impact, had catalyzed a journey of profound personal and communal transformation, illuminating a path forward filled with opportunity, connection, and the continued evolution of self. That night, as she arranged her brushes and canvases for the following day, Margaret felt a deep sense of fulfillment and anticipation. The spark she had once discovered in her kitchen had ignited a flame of action, courage, and purpose. She understood that the journey was ongoing, that each day offered new challenges and opportunities, yet she was armed with the knowledge that one deliberate, courageous choice could transform fear into action, uncertainty into momentum, and isolation into meaningful connection. Margaret Turner, once paralyzed by doubt and hesitation, had changed the trajectory of her life with a single, decisive act, and the journey ahead promised continued growth, connection, and the realization that it was never too late to reclaim agency, creativity, and purpose. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Margaret Turner awoke to a quiet apartment filled with sunlight, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air as she moved toward the small table where her brushes and canvases awaited. Today felt different, electric, as if the weeks of small victories, the exhibit, the workshops, the cautious reconnection with Ethan, had accumulated into a momentum that demanded acknowledgement. She felt a surge of anticipation and trepidation. Breaking through, she realized, would require more than courage, more than persistence, more than the act of teaching. It would require complete vulnerability, a willingness to risk failure and rejection not just privately but publicly, on a scale that could redefine her understanding of herself and her place in the world. Margaret had been quietly documenting her journey online, sharing glimpses of her work and snippets of her story on social media and community forums. The response had been encouraging, a mixture of curiosity, praise, and gentle support, yet she had not dared to take the next step, a public unveiling, a declaration that her creative rebirth was not a private indulgence but a legitimate, visible expression of resilience, purpose, and vitality. She recalled the moments that had brought her here, the hesitant brushstrokes in her kitchen, the conversation with Ethan, the first hesitant workshop, the small gallery exhibit. Each moment had been a step forward, yet the true breakthrough demanded a larger leap. Margaret decided that the time had come to apply for a regional art festival, one that would place her work alongside established and emerging artists alike. The thought made her pulse quicken. The idea of being judged by experts, of standing beside younger artists with more training, more recognition, more confidence, was terrifying. Yet she knew that fear was the signal of growth, the indicator that she was on the precipice of transformation. She spent the morning carefully photographing her paintings, selecting the pieces that most authentically represented her journey and voice. Each image was a careful balance of vulnerability and pride, revealing her growth while preserving the rawness that made her work compelling. As she prepared the submission, Margaret felt the familiar sting of self-doubt. Who am I to compete with people half my age? What if they reject me? What if this is all a mistake? She recalled Elon Musk's words from a podcast she had listened to months ago, the way he spoke about failure. Failure is an option here. If you're not failing, you're not innovating enough. Margaret repeated the phrase to herself, feeling its resonance deepen. Failure was not a reflection of worth but a byproduct of daring, a necessary companion on the path of meaningful creation. She submitted her application, her hands trembling as she pressed the final button, then exhaled deeply, the weight of anticipation pressing into her chest but also freeing her in a strange, exhilarating way. Days passed slowly, each moment stretched by expectation. Margaret continued her workshops, painting daily, and documenting her creative journey, yet the looming notification of the festival's decision occupied her thoughts relentlessly. The first sign of external validation arrived via email: her submission had been accepted. Margaret stared at the message, disbelief and elation mingling in her chest. She had broken through the self-imposed boundaries of fear, doubt, and age, stepping into a public arena where her work would be seen, judged, and appreciated alongside others. The weeks leading to the festival were intense. Margaret prepared additional pieces, refined techniques, experimented with larger canvases, and rehearsed the story she would share with visitors. She noticed a transformation within herself. Her confidence had grown, her sense of purpose had deepened, and her connection with her own voice, creative, courageous, and authentic, had solidified. As the festival day arrived, Margaret loaded her paintings into her car, the familiar thrill of anticipation mingling with nerves. The venue buzzed with activity, artists setting up booths, arranging work, and sharing greetings. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and intimidation, acutely aware of her position as a woman who had returned to art later in life, her journey marked by decades of caution and self-doubt. She arranged her paintings with care, ensuring that each piece communicated the journey she had undertaken, the courage required to reclaim her voice, and the vibrancy that had been rekindled within her. Visitors began to flow through the space, their eyes scanning canvases, noting technique, composition, and emotional resonance. Margaret observed their reactions closely, noticing moments of pause, smiles, whispered admiration, and the occasional pointed question. One young artist paused in front of her largest canvas, tilting her head thoughtfully. "This is incredible," she said. "It's full of emotion. How long have you been painting?" Margaret smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "Not as long as I wish," she replied. "But every day counts, and I've learned it's never too late to start." The words were not merely polite conversation, they were a reflection of her lived truth, a testament to the power of persistence and courage. Throughout the day, Margaret shared her story with visitors, discussing her rediscovery of creativity, the workshops she had initiated, and the journey from fear and doubt to action and expression. Each interaction reinforced her sense of breakthrough, as strangers acknowledged her courage, her resilience, and the authenticity of her work. The highlight of the day came unexpectedly. A local art critic, known for her discerning eye and sharp commentary, paused in front of Margaret's paintings, reading the brief biography she had provided. The critic circled, taking in the bold colors, dynamic composition, and palpable emotional depth. Finally, she turned to Margaret and said, "Your work carries a vitality that is rare. It's not just skill, it's a story, a journey. People will feel it." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Validation from an expert, someone whose judgment had once seemed unreachable, solidified the breakthrough she had been building toward. The journey from hesitant brushstrokes in her kitchen to recognition at a regional festival felt both surreal and profoundly deserved. Throughout the day, Margaret also noticed the effect her presence had on others. Participants in her workshops, friends, and new acquaintances who had followed her journey online expressed admiration, inspired by her courage and tenacity. She realized that breaking through was not only about personal achievement but also about creating ripples that encouraged and empowered others to act, to risk, and to reclaim parts of themselves they had long neglected. As evening approached, the festival announced awards and recognition. Margaret did not anticipate accolades, her focus had been on participation and exposure. Yet when her name was called for a special mention recognizing outstanding storytelling through art, she felt a rush of emotion that defied description. Walking to the stage, Margaret's legs trembled, not from age alone but from the culmination of fear, courage, persistence, and action. She accepted the recognition humbly, thanking the organizers, her supporters, and, in her mind, the symbolic guidance of figures like Elon Musk, whose example had taught her the value of persistence, courage, and daring action. That night, Margaret returned home, carrying her paintings and a profound sense of accomplishment. She reflected on the journey, the hesitancy, the skepticism, the workshops, the reconnection with her son, and now public recognition. She understood that breaking through was not a singular moment but a cumulative process, built upon deliberate choices, repeated actions, and the willingness to face fear and vulnerability. She documented the day in her notebook, her handwriting deliberate and steady. She reflected not only on her own achievement but on the potential to extend this breakthrough further, to continue teaching, creating, and inspiring others. Margaret recognized that breakthrough was both personal and relational, a transformation that could ripple outward, affecting others through modeling courage, persistence, and action. The following days were filled with reflection, planning, and continued creative effort. Margaret's workshops gained popularity, drawing more participants eager to reclaim creativity and agency in their own lives. Her online documentation of the festival, shared stories, and continued artwork attracted attention, further amplifying the impact of her breakthrough. She realized that breaking through was not an endpoint but a threshold, a launchpad for sustained action, connection, and influence. Margaret also noticed a subtle but profound shift within herself. Her confidence had solidified, her fear had diminished, and her sense of purpose had deepened. She no longer felt paralyzed by doubt or age-related limitations, instead, she approached each day with intention, courage, and the knowledge that meaningful action, even at 68, could produce tangible transformation. In conversations with her son, Ethan, she sensed a growing bond, strengthened by shared experiences and his witnessing of her courage and determination. The breakthrough was not only in public recognition but in the rebuilding of trust, intimacy, and understanding between mother and son. Margaret reflected on the symbolic significance of her journey. A woman who had once believed her potential had passed now stood in a position of influence, creativity, and recognition, demonstrating that age, fear, and societal expectation need not define the trajectory of one's life. The breakthrough had been achieved through deliberate, courageous action, persistence in the face of skepticism, and a willingness to risk vulnerability, illustrating the universal principle that transformation is both possible and deeply rewarding at any stage of life. As Margaret prepared for her next painting session, she felt the continued flame of motivation, the quiet confidence that each action taken in alignment with purpose and courage reinforced the trajectory she had chosen. She understood that life would continue to present challenges, doubts, and skepticism, yet she was now equipped with both experience and evidence of the power of action to overcome fear. Margaret Turner had broken through, and the breakthrough extended beyond personal achievement. It created opportunities for connection, inspiration, and continued growth, reinforcing the transformative potential of deliberate, courageous action at any age. That night, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment: hesitant strokes in a quiet kitchen, reconnection with her son, the workshops, and now recognition at a regional festival. Each moment, each action, each choice had compounded to produce a breakthrough that was both visible and deeply internal, a testament to courage, persistence, and the transformative power of action despite fear. Margaret knew that the journey was far from over. There were more workshops to teach, more paintings to create, more connections to rebuild, and more lives to touch with the example of persistence, courage, and agency. Yet the breakthrough had provided her with clarity, momentum, and confidence. She had acted decisively, embraced vulnerability, and transformed fear into achievement. The spark she had once discovered in her kitchen had grown into a steady flame of purpose, creativity, and influence, guiding her toward continued action and deeper fulfillment. Margaret Turner, once paralyzed by fear, doubt, and societal expectation, had broken through, reclaiming her creativity, purpose, and voice, and she understood that this was only the beginning of a journey defined by courage, persistence, and the willingness to act despite fear. Margaret Turner returned home from the festival with a quiet exhilaration, her car filled with canvases, certificates, and a renewed sense of purpose that hummed through her very bones. She parked in front of her apartment building, feeling the late afternoon sun warm her face, the shadows stretching long across the pavement as if mirroring the journey she had walked to this point. The apartment, once just a place of quiet solitude and tentative experimentation, now felt charged with meaning, alive with possibility, a space transformed by courage, action, and deliberate choice. Margaret arranged her newly returned paintings in her studio corner, stepping back to take in the breadth of her journey laid out before her. Each canvas told a story, not only of her emotions and creativity but of persistence, courage, and reclaiming agency in a life that had long been constrained by fear, doubt, and societal expectations. She realized that her journey was not just personal. It had begun to ripple outward, touching students in her workshops, strangers online, friends who had witnessed her transformation, and even her son, Ethan, who now engaged with her not only through conversation but also through shared experiences and subtle gestures of reconciliation. Margaret reflected on what she had learned, that purpose and passion do not expire with age, that action compounded over time creates momentum, and that courage is contagious, influencing others simply by being visible and authentic. She thought about the one decisive act that had catalyzed this transformation, the choice to teach, to share her journey, to risk vulnerability, and to extend her influence beyond herself. That singular commitment had created a domino effect, producing tangible and emotional outcomes that far exceeded the initial step. Margaret decided that the next stage of her life would be to intentionally build a legacy, a tangible and enduring expression of the transformation she had undergone and the values she wished to impart: courage, persistence, creativity, and connection. She began drafting a plan, a simple yet deliberate roadmap, detailing ways to expand her workshops, mentor others, document her journey, and perhaps even create a small community gallery where local artists could display their work, regardless of age or previous recognition. The idea of creating a space that would outlast her own participation excited her, filling her with the warmth of purpose and the thrill of shaping something that mattered beyond the boundaries of her own life. Margaret recognized that legacy was not about fame or accolades, it was about impact, about cultivating ripples of influence that encouraged others to reclaim agency, creativity, and courage. She envisioned former students returning as mentors, sharing their own stories of reclamation, and fostering an intergenerational network of creativity, connection, and inspiration. This legacy, she realized, would be an enduring testament to the principle that life's value does not diminish with age, it can, in fact, expand when one chooses courage over complacency, action over hesitation, and authenticity over conformity. As she worked on the plan, Margaret received a message from Ethan. He had been inspired by her story, her resilience, and her willingness to act despite fear. He expressed pride in her achievements and suggested collaborating on a small project that combined his interests with her creative expertise. Margaret felt a surge of joy and purpose, recognizing that legacy was not only external but relational, cultivated in the lives of those we touch through mentorship, example, and connection. She replied with enthusiasm, laying the groundwork for collaboration and reaffirming the bonds that had been tentatively rebuilt over the past weeks. Margaret also reflected on the symbolic influence of figures like Elon Musk in her journey. Though she had never met him personally, his example of persistence, audacious thinking, and willingness to face repeated failures had provided a template for courage and resilience. She realized that legacy was not only personal but also inspired by those who challenge conventional limits, who model radical action, and who demonstrate that transformative impact requires bold choices, relentless focus, and the acceptance of risk. In the following weeks, Margaret expanded her workshops, welcoming participants from broader communities, including adults who had long felt their passions and dreams were unattainable. The workshops became incubators of creativity and courage, spaces where vulnerability was honored, experimentation encouraged, and fear transformed into action. Margaret documented each session, capturing stories, photographs, and reflections that she shared online to inspire others beyond her immediate circle. She noticed remarkable transformations in participants. Adults who had long abandoned artistic pursuits reclaimed them, individuals discovered new facets of creativity, and a sense of community and belonging flourished. Margaret recognized that the cumulative effect of these efforts was the creation of a living legacy, one that extended her influence and purpose far beyond her immediate actions. She also experienced a transformation in her personal life. Her relationship with Ethan deepened, evolving from cautious reconnection to active collaboration and mutual support. They worked together on creative projects, shared insights, and began to repair the years of distance that had once seemed insurmountable. Margaret realized that legacy is not only about public recognition or community impact, it is also cultivated through relationships, trust, and the willingness to act in ways that foster reconnection, understanding, and love. One afternoon, Margaret sat in her studio, reflecting on the broader implications of her journey. She recognized that her life had been transformed not by a single monumental achievement but by the accumulation of deliberate, courageous acts, picking up the brush, facing skepticism, teaching, sharing her story, and stepping into public recognition. Each act, small in isolation, compounded into a powerful, transformative momentum that created a legacy both visible and deeply personal. She thought about the lives she had touched through her workshops and online presence. Messages of gratitude and inspiration arrived regularly, strangers sharing how her courage encouraged them to reclaim creative pursuits or take action in areas of their own lives that had long been neglected. Margaret felt the profound fulfillment of realizing that her journey had become a catalyst for others, a ripple effect that extended far beyond her own intentions. She also reflected on the importance of intentionality in creating legacy. The one decisive act, choosing to teach, had provided a focal point for growth, influence, and sustained action. Margaret recognized that legacy is not a passive accumulation of achievements, it requires conscious effort, deliberate choices, and the willingness to invest energy, vulnerability, and courage into endeavors that have meaning and impact. Margaret began planning a small exhibition and celebration for her workshop participants, a culmination of their collective creative efforts. She wanted to honor their courage, their experimentation, and their willingness to act despite fear, reinforcing the principle that agency and purpose are accessible at any stage of life. The event was meticulously organized, from arranging the space and selecting works to preparing a short presentation about the transformative journey they had undertaken together. On the day of the celebration, Margaret observed her students as they arrived, their expressions a mixture of pride, excitement, and nervous anticipation. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment as she witnessed the tangible impact of her guidance, encouragement, and example. The exhibition opened, and visitors, family, friends, local artists, and community members, began to circulate, pausing to admire, question, and discuss the works on display. Margaret moved quietly among the attendees, observing interactions, sharing stories, and offering encouragement. The atmosphere was electric, filled with validation, recognition, and the palpable sense that courage, persistence, and action had produced meaningful, visible results. During the event, a local newspaper journalist approached Margaret, intrigued by the story of a woman reclaiming creativity and purpose later in life and inspiring others through workshops and mentorship. She interviewed Margaret, asking about her motivations, challenges, and reflections on transformation. Margaret spoke candidly, sharing the journey from fear and hesitation to action, the influence of role models like Elon Musk in modeling persistence and audacious thinking, and the profound joy of seeing others reclaim their own agency and creativity. The journalist promised to feature the story, further extending the reach and impact of Margaret's work. Later that evening, as Margaret returned home, she reflected on the significance of the day. She realized that the combination of personal transformation, relational reconnection, public recognition, and community impact represented the creation of a legacy that was both tangible and deeply meaningful. She understood that the journey had been cumulative, that courage and purpose had to be exercised repeatedly to produce lasting influence, and that legacy is not an endpoint but an ongoing, evolving process. Margaret also recognized that her journey could serve as a model for others who felt constrained by age, fear, or societal expectations. She understood that meaningful action at any stage of life could catalyze personal growth, relational healing, and community transformation. The narrative of her journey, hesitant beginnings, facing skepticism, embracing courage, and breaking through into public recognition, provided a roadmap for others seeking to reclaim agency, creativity, and purpose. In the weeks that followed, Margaret continued to expand her workshops, develop new programs, and document the evolving impact of her efforts. She collaborated with other artists, mentors, and community members to create a sustainable network of support and inspiration, ensuring that the legacy she had begun to build would continue beyond her direct involvement. She also deepened her personal practices, maintaining daily painting routines, reflective journaling, and intentional engagement with students, family, and community. Margaret Turner had transformed her life through deliberate, courageous action, reclaiming creativity, purpose, and agency at an age when many had resigned themselves to passivity and limitation. Her legacy was unfolding in real time, visible in the art she created, the lives she touched, the relationships she nurtured, and the inspiration she extended to others. She understood that legacy is not merely what is left behind after death but what is actively cultivated, sustained, and shared throughout life. That night, Margaret sat in her studio, surrounded by canvases, photographs, and notes documenting the journey that had brought her here. She reflected on the cumulative power of small, deliberate actions, the compounding impact of courage, and the transformative potential of choosing to act despite fear and doubt. She felt gratitude for the journey, for the spark that had ignited in her kitchen months earlier, for the workshops, the exhibit, the reconnection with her son, and the ripple effects extending outward into her community. Margaret Turner understood that her legacy was not a distant aspiration but a living, evolving force, rooted in courage, action, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability, risk, and purpose. She resolved to continue, to act boldly, and to cultivate influence, connection, and inspiration wherever possible. The flame of possibility that had been lit within her was now a steady fire, illuminating the path forward, guiding each choice, and empowering her to build a life, and a legacy, that was vibrant, impactful, and enduring. Margaret Turner, once constrained by fear, doubt, and societal expectation, had not only reclaimed her own life but had begun to create a legacy that would continue to inspire, connect, and empower others, proving that meaningful transformation is possible at any stage, and that courage, persistence, and deliberate action are the foundations of a life that matters. Margaret Turner woke early that morning, the sunlight spilling into her studio and casting warm shadows across her canvases. She lingered over her coffee, gazing at the spectrum of colors in the room, each painting a testament to courage, persistence, and reclaimed purpose. She felt a deep sense of gratitude, a quiet joy that had been absent for decades, yet she also recognized that reflection was only the first step. Momentum was needed to transform insight into sustained action. Margaret spent the morning reviewing her journey, her journals filled with careful notes about her fears, doubts, breakthroughs, and small victories. She read passages about the hesitancy she had once felt picking up a brush in her kitchen, the apprehension before her first workshop, the anxious anticipation of the art festival, and the tentative reconnection with her son, Ethan. Each recollection reminded her that the journey of transformation was cumulative, built upon countless small decisions to act despite fear, to embrace vulnerability, and to persist despite skepticism. She realized that reflection was not an endpoint but a springboard for forward momentum, a tool to consolidate lessons, recognize growth, and set the stage for continued action. Margaret thought about the participants in her workshops, the adults who had long believed their passions were unreachable. She considered the ripple effects she had witnessed, individuals reclaiming creativity, discovering latent talent, reconnecting with purpose, and sharing their journeys with others. Margaret understood that the momentum she cultivated within herself had generated momentum in others, reinforcing the principle that courageous action compounds, extending beyond the individual to influence community, relationships, and culture. That morning, Margaret also reflected on her evolving relationship with Ethan. He had become more involved, visiting her studio, discussing creative projects, and offering feedback on new ideas. Their bond was strengthened not only by shared activity but by witnessing each other's courage, persistence, and growth. Margaret understood that forward momentum required relational reinforcement, mutual support, and the willingness to cultivate trust and intimacy over time. Inspired, she drafted a plan to scale her workshops, combining in-person sessions with online classes to reach a wider audience. She considered offering mentorship opportunities, connecting experienced participants with newcomers, fostering a network of support and encouragement. Margaret also explored partnerships with local schools, community centers, and senior organizations, recognizing that extending momentum required intentional outreach, resource allocation, and strategic action. As she worked on the plan, Margaret considered the symbolic influence of figures like Elon Musk, who had repeatedly demonstrated the value of audacious action, relentless persistence, and the willingness to face failure. She recalled his words about embracing risk, challenging assumptions, and pushing beyond perceived limits. Margaret realized that momentum, like courage, must be actively cultivated. It is not passive but requires consistent effort, adaptability, and resilience in the face of obstacles. That afternoon, Margaret hosted a workshop focused on collaborative creation. She arranged participants in pairs and groups, encouraging them to combine styles, techniques, and visions. The energy in the room was electric, a palpable buzz of creativity, vulnerability, and connection. Margaret observed transformations in real time. Hesitant strokes became confident expressions, timid suggestions evolved into bold collaboration, and isolated individuals discovered the power of shared vision. She moved among the participants, offering guidance, encouragement, and affirmation. The room became a microcosm of momentum, small acts of courage and creativity compounding to generate collective energy, innovation, and growth. Margaret reflected on the parallel between this workshop and her own journey. Each participant's breakthrough mirrored her own path: initial hesitation, facing skepticism, deliberate action, and eventual empowerment. She recognized that the momentum of transformation is both personal and relational, emerging from repeated acts of courage, sustained effort, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability publicly and privately. After the workshop, Margaret documented the outcomes in her journals, noting patterns, breakthroughs, and areas for continued growth. She considered how momentum could be maintained, by introducing new challenges, encouraging reflection, fostering peer support, and creating tangible milestones. She also contemplated long-term goals, community exhibitions, online platforms to share work and stories, and collaborative projects that could amplify the ripple effects of courage and action. The following week, Margaret received an invitation to speak at a local conference on adult creativity and lifelong learning. The request filled her with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Public speaking was not a strength she had cultivated, and the thought of addressing a large audience induced a flutter of anxiety. Yet Margaret recognized this as an opportunity to further momentum, to inspire, to model courage, and to extend the influence of her journey to a broader community. She prepared meticulously, drafting notes, selecting visuals of her work in her workshops, and practicing in front of mirrors and trusted friends. The act of preparation itself reinforced her confidence and determination, reminding her that momentum is reinforced through deliberate, repeated effort. On the day of the conference, Margaret stood backstage, listening to the murmur of the audience, her heart pounding with anticipation. She recalled the weeks of hesitation, the skepticism she had faced, the courage required to begin again, and the ripple effects her actions had generated. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage, projecting warmth, authenticity, and confidence. She shared her story candidly, the isolation, fear, and doubt of early years, the decisive choice to teach, the breakthroughs in public recognition, and the transformative impact on herself and others. Margaret emphasized the principle that momentum compounds when courage is exercised consistently, vulnerability is embraced, and deliberate action is prioritized over hesitation. The audience listened intently, some nodding in recognition, others leaning forward in curiosity, and many taking notes or recording her words. Margaret observed the energy in the room, sensing that her story was resonating, inspiring individuals to reconsider assumptions about age, capability, and the potential for change. She concluded her presentation with a call to action, to embrace fear, take deliberate steps toward meaningful pursuits, and recognize that momentum is created through repeated courage, sustained effort, and intentional engagement. Following the conference, Margaret received messages, emails, and conversations from attendees expressing gratitude, inspiration, and determination to act in their own lives. Individuals shared plans to return to creative pursuits, reconnect with estranged family members, and pursue goals they had long deferred. Margaret felt a profound sense of fulfillment, recognizing that forward momentum was no longer limited to her personal journey but had begun to extend outward, influencing others to reclaim agency, creativity, and purpose. Returning home, Margaret reflected on the cumulative power of her actions, small steps compounded into workshops, exhibitions, community engagement, public speaking, and mentorship. She recognized that momentum was both a force and a responsibility. It required attention, deliberate action, and consistent nurturing to sustain and amplify impact. Margaret documented her reflections, considering strategies to maintain momentum over the coming months, including expanding her online presence, developing new workshops, fostering peer mentorship, and creating a tangible archive of the cumulative journey. She understood that momentum was dynamic, requiring adaptation, perseverance, and willingness to embrace new opportunities while remaining grounded in purpose. As weeks turned into months, Margaret observed remarkable changes in her community of participants. Adults who had once doubted their abilities began to embrace creativity with confidence, sharing work publicly, mentoring others, and engaging in collaborative projects. Margaret facilitated these processes, providing guidance, encouragement, and structure, yet she recognized that momentum was now self-reinforcing. Individuals inspired by her journey were extending the principles of courage and action to others. Margaret also reflected on the personal growth she continued to experience. Her confidence, resilience, and sense of purpose had deepened. Her relationship with Ethan flourished, they collaborated on projects, exchanged creative ideas, and rebuilt trust through shared effort and mutual recognition. Margaret understood that momentum was not merely external but internal, a continuous process of learning, growth, and sustained engagement with purpose-driven action. She noted the subtle, profound changes in herself: increased energy, clarity of intention, strengthened emotional resilience, and a sense of alignment between values and action. Margaret recognized that momentum is cyclical: reflection informs action, action generates results, results inspire further reflection, and the cycle continues, producing sustained growth, influence, and fulfillment. She considered the lessons she had internalized: courage is exercised in incremental steps, persistence compounds over time, vulnerability enables connection, and deliberate action transforms fear into agency. Margaret also reflected on the symbolic power of role models like Elon Musk, whose willingness to act despite failure, embrace risk, and pursue audacious goals mirrored her own journey in miniature. Deliberate, bold action combined with persistence produces transformative outcomes, regardless of age or circumstance. Margaret decided to document these insights more formally, creating a reflective journal and guide for adults seeking to reclaim creativity, purpose, and agency. She envisioned a resource that captured her experiences, practical strategies, and philosophical reflections, designed to inspire and empower others to cultivate momentum in their own lives. The act of documenting not only reinforced her learning but also extended her influence, ensuring that the principles of courage, persistence, and deliberate action could be shared beyond her immediate community. One afternoon, Margaret sat in her studio, reviewing the submissions for an upcoming collaborative exhibition. Participants had created remarkable work, demonstrating the compounding impact of sustained momentum, courage, and creative engagement. Margaret marveled at the transformation she had witnessed. Individuals who had once doubted themselves now expressed creativity with confidence, shared ideas freely, and inspired one another. She realized that forward momentum had not only changed her life but had cultivated an environment in which transformation became self-reinforcing, a living legacy of courage, action, and creativity. That evening, Margaret reflected on her journey from hesitation to breakthrough, from isolation to influence, and from fear to purposeful momentum. She recognized that the principle of forward momentum applied broadly: life's potential is realized not in singular acts but in consistent, deliberate, courageous choices, sustained over time and extended through relationships, mentorship, and community engagement. Margaret Turner, once paralyzed by fear, doubt, and societal expectation, had created not only a personal transformation but also a network of influence and impact, demonstrating that momentum, once cultivated, generates ripples that extend far beyond the initial action. She resolved to continue, to act boldly, to nurture momentum in herself and others, and to embrace each day as an opportunity for meaningful, purposeful, courageous action. The flame she had discovered in her kitchen months ago had grown into a steady, transformative force, guiding her life, inspiring others, and establishing forward momentum as both a principle and a lived reality, proof that even later in life, agency, purpose, and impact can be reclaimed, nurtured, and multiplied. Margaret Turner woke to a crisp morning, the sunlight streaming through the window and illuminating the studio she had gradually transformed into a hub of creativity, courage, and connection. The energy in the room was palpable, a reflection not only of her own growth but of the growing community she had nurtured through workshops, mentorship, and exhibitions. Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose as she moved around the space, reviewing the schedule for the week, checking in with participants, and planning her next series of initiatives. She recognized that the breakthrough she had achieved, the decision to teach, to share her journey, and to embrace vulnerability, had created momentum that could now be directed toward expanding influence, reaching more individuals, and cultivating a broader, sustainable impact. Margaret began her day by drafting a strategic plan. She outlined goals for expanding workshops beyond the local community, incorporating online classes to reach participants across the state and even nationally. She considered partnerships with senior centers, schools, libraries, and art organizations, recognizing that influence grows when networks are leveraged and opportunities are created for collaboration and resource sharing. Margaret also reflected on the importance of storytelling in expanding influence. Her own journey, from hesitation and isolation to courage, creativity, and public recognition, served as a compelling model for others. She realized that sharing her story openly, through written reflections, social media, workshops, and public speaking, could inspire individuals who had long believed it was too late to pursue passions or reclaim agency. That morning, she recorded a short video sharing her journey, highlighting the steps she had taken to overcome fear, embrace vulnerability, and cultivate momentum. She spoke candidly about setbacks, moments of doubt, and the small victories that had compounded into meaningful transformation. Margaret emphasized the principle that action, no matter how small or tentative, generates momentum, and that age, societal expectations, and fear need not constrain one's potential. The response was immediate. Messages poured in from individuals expressing gratitude, sharing their own stories of hesitation, and describing renewed motivation to act in areas of their lives they had long deferred. Margaret felt a surge of exhilaration and responsibility. Expanding influence was not merely about personal recognition but about creating a platform for others to reclaim agency, pursue passion, and transform fear into action. That afternoon, Margaret hosted a workshop focused on collaborative projects with broader social impact. Participants were encouraged to work together to create art that reflected personal stories, community issues, or aspirations for change. The energy in the room was electric, the hum of creativity and discussion filling the space. Margaret observed the dynamics carefully, guiding individuals to balance personal expression with collaborative engagement, nurturing confidence while fostering meaningful connections. The workshop culminated in a group installation, a tapestry of personal and collective narratives expressed through color, texture, and form. Margaret marveled at the result. The artwork was a living testament to the power of courage, creativity, and deliberate action, and it symbolized the potential for individuals to create collective impact when given opportunity, guidance, and support. That evening, Margaret reflected on the ways influence could be intentionally expanded. She drafted a proposal for a regional traveling exhibition, featuring work from her workshops and inviting contributions from adults reclaiming creativity across multiple communities. The project would amplify the ripple effects of courage and action, providing visibility and recognition for individuals who had long felt invisible or constrained by fear and societal expectations. Margaret recognized that expanding influence requires infrastructure, planning, and sustained commitment. She began to identify collaborators, potential sponsors, and venues, understanding that scaling impact necessitates both vision and practical execution. Over the following weeks, Margaret implemented the first phase of the regional initiative. She coordinated with local art centers, libraries, and senior organizations, providing resources, guidance, and mentorship to participants. The workshops attracted diverse adults, each carrying their own stories of hesitation, doubt, and latent potential. Margaret observed the transformation with fascination and pride. Participants reclaimed creative expression, built confidence, and formed connections across generations and communities. The impact was tangible, extending beyond the studio walls into participants' homes, relationships, and daily lives. Margaret also focused on developing leadership within the community. She encouraged experienced participants to mentor newcomers, fostering a culture of empowerment and shared responsibility. This approach not only strengthened the sustainability of the initiative but also reinforced the principle that influence is amplified when courage and action are modeled and disseminated across networks. Margaret's own growth continued as she embraced the challenges of coordination, public engagement, and mentorship. She discovered skills she had long underestimated: project management, strategic communication, and the ability to inspire through example. She reflected on the lessons from her journey. Momentum is cultivated through deliberate action, courage compounds through repeated practice, and influence is expanded by sharing knowledge, creating opportunities, and modeling persistent engagement despite fear and doubt. During this time, Margaret also began speaking at community forums, schools, and local events. She shared her story candidly, emphasizing that age does not limit potential, that courage is a muscle developed through action, and that deliberate, consistent effort yields transformative outcomes. Her presentations were well received, inspiring individuals to reconsider assumptions about their own limitations and to pursue previously deferred goals. Margaret recognized the symbolic resonance of her story, a woman reclaiming agency and creativity later in life, creating momentum that extended to others, and demonstrating that influence is cultivated through consistent, courageous action rather than passive expectation. One afternoon, Margaret received an invitation to participate in a televised interview highlighting adults reclaiming purpose and creativity. She felt both exhilaration and apprehension. Public exposure was daunting, yet she recognized it as an opportunity to expand influence exponentially. Margaret prepared meticulously, reviewing key points, refining her message, and practicing responses to potential questions. She reflected on Elon Musk's example of facing public scrutiny, embracing risk, and using visibility as a platform for influence and change. The interview proceeded smoothly. Margaret shared her journey authentically, highlighting the steps she had taken to overcome fear, cultivate momentum, and create sustainable influence through workshops, mentorship, and public engagement. She emphasized that deliberate action, courage, and persistence are accessible at any age, and that influence is magnified when individuals model these principles for others. The broadcast generated a significant response. Emails, messages, and social media comments poured in, many from adults inspired to reclaim creativity, pursue passions, or reconnect with estranged family and community members. Margaret felt the tangible power of expanded influence. Her story, actions, and guidance were catalyzing real-world changes beyond her immediate sphere. She understood that influence is both a responsibility and an opportunity, requiring integrity, persistence, and consistent action to produce meaningful outcomes. Following the broadcast, Margaret continued to refine and expand her initiatives. She developed a series of online resources, including instructional videos, reflective journals, and community forums, designed to provide sustained support for individuals seeking to reclaim agency, creativity, and purpose. She collaborated with other artists, mentors, and educators to create a network of support and guidance, ensuring that the principles of courage, persistence, and deliberate action could reach a broad and diverse audience. Margaret also began writing a guidebook, distilling the lessons from her journey into practical advice, reflections, and exercises for adults seeking transformation. The project required sustained effort, discipline, and courage to share personal vulnerabilities publicly, yet she recognized that documentation and dissemination were essential to creating lasting influence and legacy. Throughout this process, Margaret observed the ripple effects of her expanded influence. Former workshop participants initiated their own community projects, shared their creative work publicly, and inspired others to pursue deferred goals. Families reconnected, friendships were renewed, and individuals discovered newfound confidence and agency. Margaret understood that influence is most powerful when it catalyzes independent action, enabling others to build momentum, overcome fear, and cultivate purpose in their own lives. Margaret also reflected on her personal growth through this expansion. Her confidence, resilience, and sense of purpose deepened as she navigated challenges, managed projects, and guided others. She discovered the satisfaction of leadership and mentorship, the joy of witnessing tangible transformations in others, and the fulfillment of contributing meaningfully to her community. Margaret recognized that influence is mutually reinforcing. The more she acted courageously and intentionally, the more others were inspired, and the more inspired individuals reinforced her own sense of purpose and momentum. As months passed, Margaret's initiatives became well established, attracting participants from across multiple communities and generating a growing network of adults engaged in reclaiming creativity, purpose, and agency. The workshops, online resources, mentorship programs, and public speaking engagements created a multi-layered platform for sustained influence. Margaret realized that deliberate, consistent action, grounded in courage, persistence, and authenticity, was the foundation of lasting impact. Margaret reflected on the principle that momentum and influence are dynamic, requiring ongoing engagement, adaptability, and responsiveness to emerging opportunities and challenges. She understood that expanding influence is not a static achievement but an evolving process that grows through sustained effort, community collaboration, and the amplification of courage and action across networks. One evening, as Margaret arranged her studio, reviewing correspondence, workshop schedules, and upcoming projects, she paused to reflect on the journey from hesitation to breakthrough, from personal transformation to community influence. She recognized that each stage had been essential. Reclaiming creativity, reconnecting with her son, creating workshops, breaking through public recognition, and now expanding influence to touch lives beyond her immediate sphere. Margaret understood that influence is both personal and relational, built upon authenticity, courage, and sustained effort, and that meaningful legacy emerges when individuals intentionally cultivate momentum that inspires and empowers others. That night, Margaret sat at her desk, writing reflections on her journey, the principles of courage and action, and the strategies for expanding influence. She considered future initiatives, opportunities for collaboration, and ways to further scale impact. She resolved to continue acting boldly, nurturing momentum, and extending her reach, confident that deliberate, courageous action produces ripples that extend far beyond the initial act. Margaret Turner, once constrained by fear, doubt, and societal expectation, had expanded her influence from personal transformation to community empowerment, demonstrating that courage, persistence, and deliberate action can generate meaningful, sustainable impact at any stage of life. The flame that had been sparked in her quiet kitchen months earlier had grown into a force of momentum, connection, and influence, illuminating the path forward and creating opportunities for others to reclaim creativity, purpose, and agency. Margaret understood that the work of expanding influence is ongoing, iterative, and deeply rewarding, and she committed herself to continue cultivating courage, modeling action, and inspiring others to act boldly in pursuit of meaningful, transformative outcomes. Margaret Turner woke to a quiet morning, the sun spilling golden light across her studio, reflecting off the myriad canvases that told the story of her journey from hesitation to transformation. She sipped her coffee slowly, savoring the warmth and stillness, yet she knew that the day demanded more than reflection, it demanded action, the deliberate cultivation of mentorship and the ripple effect that would extend her influence beyond her immediate reach. Margaret had observed over the past months that influence alone was not enough. Sustainable transformation required intentional guidance, connection, and the modeling of courage and persistence. She drafted a schedule for the day, focusing on one-on-one mentorship sessions with participants from her workshops, paired with group projects designed to encourage collaboration, innovation, and mutual support. The room hummed with anticipation as participants arrived, their energy reflecting a mixture of curiosity, nervousness, and excitement. Many were adults returning to creativity after decades of deferral, their confidence tentative but present. Margaret greeted each individual warmly, acknowledging their courage in showing up and reinforcing the principle that action, no matter how small, is the foundation for momentum. The first mentorship session involved a young man named Carl, who had retired 5 years ago and was struggling to reconnect with artistic pursuits he had abandoned in his youth. Carl expressed self-doubt and frustration, worried that he was too late, that his skills had diminished, and that others might judge his work harshly. Margaret listened intently, validating his feelings, sharing her own experiences of hesitation, and emphasizing the cumulative power of deliberate action. She guided him through exercises designed to rebuild confidence, focusing on small, manageable projects that allowed incremental success. By the end of the session, Carl's demeanor had shifted subtly but significantly, his posture straightened, his eyes brightened, and he expressed excitement about returning home to continue his work. Margaret recognized the profound impact of mentorship, personalized guidance, encouragement, and modeling of courage can catalyze transformation, producing ripple effects as individuals internalize confidence, practice persistence, and take deliberate action in their own contexts. In the group portion of the day, Margaret introduced a collaborative project designed to create a community mural representing shared stories of resilience, hope, and creativity. Participants were paired and organized into small teams, tasked with contributing individual elements that would coalesce into a cohesive whole. The room became a dynamic space of negotiation, experimentation, and dialogue, as participants navigated creative differences, shared techniques, and learned to trust both themselves and their collaborators. Margaret moved among the teams, offering subtle guidance, encouraging risk-taking, and reinforcing the value of vulnerability as a pathway to authentic expression. By the end of the day, the mural had begun to take shape, a visual representation not only of individual creativity but of the collective courage and collaboration fostered through mentorship and deliberate facilitation. Margaret reflected on the metaphor inherent in the mural: life, like the collaborative art, is a cumulative process of individual contributions, guided by principles of connection, courage, and persistence, ultimately producing a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. That evening, Margaret held a virtual session for participants unable to attend in person. She observed the diversity of backgrounds, experiences, and aspirations, noting the common thread of fear, hesitation, and societal expectation that had previously constrained their action. Margaret emphasized that mentorship extends beyond skill development. It involves modeling courage, fostering confidence, providing accountability, and cultivating a sense of belonging that enables sustained engagement and momentum. The session concluded with participants sharing reflections, goals, and experiences, creating a sense of community that transcended geographic boundaries and reinforced the ripple effect initiated by Margaret's deliberate action. Over the following weeks, Margaret formalized a mentorship program, pairing experienced participants with newcomers, designing a structured approach to facilitate guidance, encouragement, and skill development. She introduced regular check-ins, collaborative projects, and forums for reflection, emphasizing the principles of persistence, courage, and deliberate action. Margaret recognized that the ripple effect is generated when mentorship is intentionally structured, scalable, and embedded within a culture of support and empowerment. As the program developed, Margaret observed profound transformations. Participants who had once doubted themselves began to take initiative, contribute ideas, and lead small projects. They provided encouragement to peers, sharing insights, resources, and lessons learned. The mentorship network became self-reinforcing. Confidence, skill, and courage circulated throughout the community, producing exponential growth in agency, creativity, and engagement. Margaret documented these developments carefully, noting patterns, successes, and areas for refinement. She realized that the ripple effect was not merely a byproduct but a deliberate outcome, cultivated through intentional mentorship, consistent action, and modeling of principles that empower others to act boldly despite fear and doubt. One afternoon, Margaret visited a local community center to conduct an outreach workshop for adults who had never participated in her programs. She observed hesitation, skepticism, and fear among the participants, recognizing the familiar patterns she herself had faced years ago. Margaret shared her story candidly, emphasizing that courage is developed through practice, that momentum is built incrementally, and that influence extends most powerfully when actions are deliberate, visible, and consistent. She introduced practical exercises, facilitated small group collaboration, and encouraged reflection on personal goals and aspirations. By the end of the workshop, participants expressed renewed motivation, a willingness to experiment, and a commitment to continued engagement. Margaret noted the ripple effect. Even a single workshop, conducted with intentional mentorship and deliberate modeling, can catalyze multiple layers of impact, producing transformation that extends beyond the immediate session. Returning home, Margaret reflected on the broader implications of mentorship and ripple effect. She recognized that influence is amplified when participants internalize principles, model courageous action, and extend guidance to others. Mentorship becomes a multiplier, converting individual transformation into community-wide impact. Margaret considered the long-term potential of her initiatives: sustained growth in creative confidence, strengthened relational connections, and the cultivation of a culture that values courage, persistence, and deliberate action. In the following weeks, Margaret organized a community showcase, inviting participants from various workshops and mentorship pairings to display their work publicly. The event celebrated not only artistic achievement but also courage, persistence, and the transformative potential of mentorship. Margaret observed the pride and exhilaration on participants' faces as they engaged with attendees, shared stories, and received recognition for both their creativity and their personal growth. The showcase provided tangible evidence of the ripple effect, the impact of mentorship extended beyond individual skill acquisition to community recognition, relational reconnection, and the reinforcement of principles that foster continued action and growth. Margaret also received inquiries from regional organizations seeking guidance in establishing similar programs. She recognized that expanding mentorship and ripple effects beyond her immediate sphere could amplify impact exponentially. Margaret began to develop training materials, guidelines, and workshops to support other facilitators, emphasizing the principles of courage, deliberate action, and sustainability. She reflected on the importance of documentation, systematization, and replication in creating lasting influence. One evening, as Margaret reviewed correspondence and plans, she noticed messages from former participants reporting progress, sharing achievements, and describing ways they had applied lessons from mentorship in personal and professional contexts. Margaret felt profound fulfillment. The ripple effect had moved from her immediate guidance to independent action, with participants internalizing principles and creating momentum in their own lives. Margaret recognized that mentorship is most effective when it empowers participants to act autonomously while maintaining connection, support, and accountability. She began to compile these stories into a reflective anthology, documenting the journey of courage, transformation, and ripple effect. The anthology would serve not only as a record but as a resource for others seeking guidance, inspiration, and practical strategies for cultivating momentum, agency, and influence at any stage of life. Margaret also considered her ongoing personal development. Mentorship, while rewarding, posed challenges: time management, emotional labor, and the need for consistent modeling of principles. She implemented routines for reflection, self-care, and skill enhancement, recognizing that sustainable mentorship requires balance, intentionality, and resilience. Margaret drew inspiration from Elon Musk's example of relentless persistence and willingness to face challenges head-on, internalizing the lesson that enduring impact is built through consistent, deliberate action in the face of uncertainty. As the months progressed, Margaret expanded the mentorship program to include virtual sessions, peer-to-peer learning, and community projects that addressed local social issues. Participants engaged in initiatives such as collaborative murals, public workshops, and intergenerational art projects, demonstrating the multiplicative effect of mentorship and the creation of sustained, tangible impact. Margaret observed that ripple effects extended beyond the creative domain, influencing confidence, relational connection, and civic engagement among participants. She documented these outcomes carefully, analyzing patterns, successes, and lessons learned to refine and improve the program. Margaret realized that mentorship and ripple effect are dynamic, requiring ongoing adaptation, responsiveness to participant needs, and strategic planning to sustain and amplify impact. She noted that courage, persistence, and deliberate action are foundational to both personal transformation and community-wide influence. One afternoon, Margaret met with a local educator interested in integrating mentorship principles into their adult education curriculum. They discussed strategies for cultivating courage, momentum, and resilience in participants, drawing upon Margaret's experiences and the ripple effects observed in her programs. The meeting reinforced the importance of systemic thinking. Mentorship is most effective when embedded in structures that support repeated engagement, modeling of principles, and sustained community connection. By the end of the day, Margaret reflected on the progress achieved. The mentorship program had grown, participants were actively creating their own ripple effects, and the broader community was experiencing tangible transformation. She recognized that the work was ongoing, iterative, and deeply rewarding, and she felt a renewed sense of commitment to cultivating courage, persistence, and deliberate action in both herself and others. That evening, Margaret sat in her studio, reviewing her journals and notes from the day. She reflected on the journey from personal hesitation to breakthrough, from individual transformation to mentorship, and from influence to ripple effect. Each stage had built upon the previous, demonstrating that sustained impact requires deliberate action, courage, and the willingness to guide, support, and empower others. Margaret Turner understood that mentorship and ripple effect are not only about transferring skills but about modeling principles, fostering agency, and creating momentum that extends far beyond the immediate intervention. She resolved to continue, to act boldly, and to nurture ripple effects that empower others to reclaim creativity, purpose, and agency, confident that her deliberate actions could produce meaningful, lasting transformation in lives, communities, and future generations. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?